How would you feel if you found out your favorite NBA player was juiced on performance-enhancing drugs? In this video, I will reveal the extent to which the NBA has a PED problem, the proof that people are abusing PEDs, and a list of what current players may be guilty of taking performance-enhancing drugs. To start though, we need to understand the history. Has this been a problem historically? The NBA has been behind other sports leagues when it comes to drug testing. For example, the NFL and MLB have always been ahead of the curve when it comes to trying to detect PEDs in their players.
Also, the NBA is known for having the worst testing and test protocol of all professional sports.
1983 was the first moment that the NBA began even looking into testing for performance-enhancing drugs. And frankly, they didn't try very hard. That is until 1999 when they started getting more serious about their drug testing policies.
Science has always played catch-up to the ways athletes and coaches avoid detection of drugs in sport.
So prior to 1999, it's actually extremely difficult to know the extent of the problem of PEDs in the NBA because they weren't testing anything. What about since 1999? To what extent has the NBA had a problem with PEDs? Well, if we ignore testing for a minute and just look at other sports, we can find that lots of other sports have struggled with keeping their players off of performance-enhancing drugs.
I think there's kind of a perception from people who don't watch sports that doping is pretty rare and that most major competitions are drug-free thanks to good testing. And I want to make this video because, oh boy, is that wrong.
Breaking news now.
UCI Cycling's governing body banned Armstrong for life.
And Marion Jones would store steroids in the refrigerator.
I have no one to blame but myself.
We can safely assume that the NBA has also had similar problems. In fact, we know that the NBA is concerned with their players taking performance-enhancing drugs. Now, steroids aren't the only PEDs. There are other drugs that help you more with the endurance side of athleticism, which is an important aspect of the NBA.
For example, EPO is a very common banned drug taken by endurance athletes, which increases red blood cell production, giving your body more oxygen to use for exercise.
For NBA players, there are basically three major ways to enhance your physical performance: steroids, EPO, and HGH, otherwise known as the anti-aging serum.
But without getting a sample from the lab, it's basically impossible to detect. But here's the kicker. Even with samples from the lab, they can still be extremely difficult to detect.
But it's very, very clear that a large number are evading detection because the markers can also be easily manipulated.
So if a PED is untested and unknown, the athlete taking it can and will get away with using it. This is important because of one thing: designer drugs, or drugs that are specifically made to pass these tests.
But is there any proof of abusers within the NBA? Well, despite being weak historically in testing for PEDs, there have been a number of players that have been caught taking them.
In the realm of basketball, steroids and PEDs can vastly help with recovery time, fat loss, healing after an injury, sustaining high energy levels, and increasing endurance.
In the year 2000, a player was suspended for taking steroids. Or in the case of DeAndre Ayton, he was suspended for taking a diuretic, which is commonly used to mask the use of performance-enhancing drugs.
And then with the use of things like diuretics, microdosing, and masking agents, it becomes even harder to detect the drugs.
But remember, these are only the players that have been caught. It's commonly known that the players that are caught only represent a small sample of the actual players that are abusing PEDs.
In an anonymous survey at the 2011 World Athletics Championships, an astonishing 44% of athletes admitted to doping within the last year. But typically, only 1 to 2% of samples test positive.
Even in sports with the strictest PED rules and the most robust testing, a large number of them likely go undetected.
So how are these athletes able to bypass testing regulations? Well, it comes down to two things: poor testing infrastructure and smart science used to bypass the drug tests put on these athletes.
So are there any current players that may be guilty of taking PEDs? How can we tell unless we do testing? Well, there is one quantitative method we can use to at least give us a better idea, and it comes from a paper that was published in 1995. This paper showed a linear cutoff between those who were taking PEDs in the paper's example, it's steroids, and those who weren't taking PEDs by using the fat-free muscle index. Basically, if you have more fat-free muscle on your body than what is expected, it's a possibility that you are taking steroids. Now, this depends completely on the body fat percentage of the player, but if we apply it to some historic players, here's what we find. LeBron James crosses the steroid threshold if he's at or below 6.5% body fat. That is, if that's how lean he is, then according to this paper, he likely might be on steroids. What about Giannis Antetokounmpo, who's put on a lot of muscle over the years? Even at 0% body fat, if he were even more lean than humanly possible, he still wouldn't cross the threshold into a steroid user, according to the paper. But what about a heavier player like Shaquille O'Neal? Well, Shaquille O'Neal's number is at 20.5%. So that means when he was playing in his prime, if his body fat percentage was at or below 20.5%, he would be at the threshold where he might be taking steroids. For Carmelo, this number sits the same as LeBron James, that is 6.5%. And lastly, Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan is in the exact same boat as Giannis. Here's a list of current players that might cross the threshold, and you can see their body fat percentages that would be required for them to be considered potentially a steroid abuser. So that likely means that there's players right now in the NBA that are using PEDs and getting away with it.
Let's be honest, with the amount of money that's on the line, how many athletes are willing to take performance-enhancing to get even a slight edge?
So the NBA should do what they can to develop better ways of testing for PEDs so that we can make sure the sport is as fair as possible. Now, PEDs can help an athlete with strength, explosiveness, and even endurance, but what they can't help with are the skills that are required to be a good basketball player. You might be wondering, if it's not PEDs that make Kyrie Irving have the best handles of all time, then what is it? Check out the next video to find out.